I did the kind of lightweight post production. I don't know if you saw the little thumbnail on the thing we did yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It looked good. And then the quality was much better. So I guess they upload the video afterwards.
Yeah, so it does kind of like the live stream low bit rate, modest bit rate, let's call it, and then kind of the high def version comes in later, and you can kind of mess around
Yeah.
with the channel and create little thumbnail templates and stuff. So I'm kind of interested in just sort of learning about the whole creative process of like what goes into making good videos, because I kind of like played a lot with TikTok, making kind of just random whatever videos,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
And then
there's a certain vibe to it.
now you're feeling the urge to like be a little higher in production value.
A little bit, yeah. I just want to play with it. I don't even know. Like, I kind of just want to play with it. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
maybe high production value. Maybe it's like more. Yeah, the other thing is, I think like there's always something new in the world, right? And
Right?
like like Elad just published this AI thing, and we were
Uh-huh.
talking about AI on the phone. What was it, a couple days ago? Then that thing dropped yesterday. So it's like, okay, there's something new in the world. Like let's explore it without a lot of prep, and we're just kind of going to go off the cuff and see what we find as we explore it.
It's the knowledge worker version of watching someone code.
Right.
Have you
The
watched those
knowledge
videos?
worker, like the Twitch live stream where people are like, I'm going to make
Uh-huh.
a Hangman game or something. Yeah,
Uh-huh. Or I want to
it's
show how to use
impressive.
this new Python package or this or that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then for those who are interested, it's this great chance to watch and understand, and it's a nice reference point. There was
Yep.
Chris Albin. Do you know Chris?
I don't know.
Okay, so
Who's that?
I think he runs a chunk of data science at Wikipedia now, but he would basically live stream a bunch of their meetings, so you could actually see how data
Mm-hmm.
scientists actually work.
Mm-hmm. And what is it like? You get to see the tool suite, or sort of the
You
inputs
s-
and outputs,
no,
or kind of the whole
you get
process?
to see the disagreement in the middle of a meeting about how to think about prioritizing features
Oh,
and
I
all
see.
that sort of stuff, right?
Right.
And I think there's value in that.
Yeah. So like,
Yeah.
is there like I would sort of lay out that we're probably at this like really early stage of more stuff being shared and streamed like this, right? Like, these kinds of like a data scientist, day in the life of a data scientist. Probably
Hmm.
like, we have had zero, say decades ago. Now we have some, but probably we're on some path where that increases. And so is it going to increase dramatically? Are we going to have like, will there sometime be sort of like, companies that are just fully built in public? You can just drop in on their meetings, or is that too radical?
I mean, it is certainly common process now for lots of developers to share it for different reasons, right? Sometimes you're sharing it for marketing reasons, and sometimes you're sharing it because you're because you're committed to it ideologically, and you certainly see that in sports, right, where people will regularly broadcast or live stream people practicing,
Mm-hmm.
and folks get a chance to participate there. Whether this spreads out more throughout corporate America, I know it's an open question, but I think it's really interesting because for a lot of parts of the world, it's just really hard to know what actually happens, right? And so just that a little
Yep.
bit of extra visibility sort of makes things, it helps illuminate, one, it makes us better practitioners, but it also
Mm-hmm.
helps illuminate like sort of little blind spots. I think
Yep.
I misunderstood something about Python generators, like whatever, some random niche thing, and I didn't totally get it
Mm-hmm.
until I watched someone write something last week. I was like, oh, I didn't know
Mm.
that. That's why they're doing this. Because, at this stage in my life, I really only pull out Python when I'm trying to get something done right away. I'm not, I
Right.
won't invest the time to really figure out what's going on. And so that, that's an example.
What kind of stuff do you do, like on a, let's say a random week? Do you end up diving into a Python script once or twice, or is it kind of like a daily thing, or more like
No. It's like
some
a monthly.
project or
There's
idea?
some
Okay.
project, or there's some random thing that I'm interested in, right? Or some
And what
data
what
that I'm
type of
trying to
thing?
munch.
What type of thing? Like as an example.
I mean, for me, like I'm sure if I were, it's still easier for me to do a bunch of stuff in Python than it is to do in SQL, right? And especially like
Hmm.
there's this sort of like or well, in SQL, or to be honest, like in pivot tables, right? Like it's much easier for me to think about sticking something into a bunch of arrays and then
Hmm.
unfolding it slightly differently. Um,
Hmm.
so, I mean, that's a sort of much more boring text processing of lists, right? So and then
And are these things like for the work you do, or is it like little
yeah,
hack, like
yeah,
art
yeah. I mean, just
projects,
like
or some
it's
of?
just much more just work. That one's just much
Hmm.
more work stuff, right?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, at least my observation is that you have so many, right, like in companies right now. There's like such a huge disparity between like sort of amount of automation for different processes, right, and amount of time put in for things, and like almost no visibility. But anyway,
Hmm.
so I don't know. I'm going on a slightly different tangent. We're going to talk about generative
Yeah.
machine learning stuff. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do. So Elad dropped this piece yesterday, right? It's the AI revolution, transformers and large language models, and kind of I sort of read through that, but before I get into that, I wanted to just sort of get a little bit of lay of the land of you know when people talk about AI, are they mostly talking about transformers and large language models, or is this like one kind of frontier that is currently being pushed, and sort of how does this fit into the broader kind of topic of AI? What's relevant in the world today?
I mean, I think so. You remember, like in CS terms, right? There's AI in terms of human computer interface stuff, right? So, like how we
Mm-hmm.
interact with it. And then there's AI as sort of like frameworks for doing computation. And then there's the economic implications of it. And so on the AI side, there's still lots of angles on the straightforward HCI part, right? Sort of, and that's all the human in the loop and sort of chatbots and how we actually
Mm-hmm.
interact. And I feel like that piece is the part that you see, but folks don't really talk about a lot, even though they should probably, right? So that's one
So you're saying
piece.
like something like a chat bot is a HCI interface to some sort of backend AI,
That's
but
right.
is not
Or just
itself
to or
necessarily.
just to some back end. No, it is the AI, right? Because from my point of view, it is the interface, right? And I'm just a dumb user. I don't know any better, right? So
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a bunch of if then statements or some super sophisticated sort of large
Right.
language model, I don't really know. I just know that that's the way I interface with the thing that feels different to me, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Um, so I think that's one part of the world, and then inside, and then under the hoods, right? Sort of. Do you remember all the knowledge representation stuff? Right? Like that.
Tell me
In that
more.
case, that's more like sticking thing. Doing, um, sticking information in large graphs that then you can do computation against
Mm.
to do inference, right? So like that's
Right. It's
that's
like how are you
one
going to
part.
structure it?
Right. But that in that case is much better structured. And then there's this other like and then the world that we're talking about now that everyone's really excited about for the last few years has been some subset of machine learning, right? Which is like the case where you represent, sort of unstructured data in very long vectors and then do kind of initially what was amazing is that you'd be able to say that, sort of this thing was a car or this thing was a bluebird or whatever, right?
Right.
And
So like
then
identifying a photo, like an image,
yeah,
and mapping it
yeah.
to some other kind of known structured
Right, right.
object.
And then,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then this new version where sort of you end up generating whether it's images or text or commands or whatever, right? That feels sort of that's the part that folks have spent a bunch of time sort of saying it'd be interesting, and then suddenly it's interesting. So there's a little bit of this weird thing where I guess maybe I I thought there'd be all these things built on top of GPT-3, and then it was like limited enough that sort of there's some interesting things, but not that much, right? And then now with both, I guess, both the image stuff and and Codex, right, which is the GitHub thing, right, where they'll generate text. Both of those have expanded folks' imagination enough, right, that it changes the discussion. And what's interesting to me is that I think for most folks, I think it's a good answer around the automation versus augmentation question, because both Codex and all the stable diffusion stuff, they're pretty clearly tools, right? They're not like scary monsters that will eat us up.
Right.
So
are they like one?
Helpful.
Yeah. So we've got, let's see, where are we now? We've got kind of the, in Elad's piece, he's talking about like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and CNNs, RNNs, deep learning GANs, transformer models, stable diffusion. Like what are these all kind of flavors of each other that are kind of going to blend into each other, or will one of these things find an application that is like the really useful one that kind of everything else coalesces around? Or how do you think about like how these different techniques or approaches may solve certain kind of human problems?
Okay, so I think the big difference, or from an end user point of view, right? I think the big difference is we spent all this time thinking about models predicting things, right? Or discriminating things, saying this thing is this, sort of this loan we should approve or not based on this information,
right.
or this car ahead of us is a threat and therefore we should do this or that, right? I think we're moved, like, that's the move from that to generative stuff, I think, is the surprising big shift. And
that's kind of the frontier we're at now.
I think I think that in some ways is fundamentally different. And it requires a whole set of underlying technical advances, which folks are in the middle of, right? But I think for product people and for business people, like just sort of like splitting that, just thinking of those as two different categories of machine learning things, I think is helpful.
Kind of the identification, knowing, structuring what is, and then generating what is not yet.
That's right.
Kind of
and then, of course, I think the folks that would be
creation of the future.
The folks that would be more careful in their use of language would say something like, well, it's still just prediction, right? And it is in many ways still just prediction, but it's the solution space is so much bigger that dynamic feels very different.
Right. And so when you sort of think about these spaces, and I guess you think about them, I guess, both from just like a maybe curiosity perspective of like what can be done and what are the cool new things that get unlocked, but then also, kind of in your day job, you're thinking about like what kinds of businesses, or like, is this a credible structure to build something that's going to generate kind of economic value, right? And so that's like, are those pretty divergent, or do they like very often overlap, or like how does sort of the curiosity versus economic stuff fit together?
You mean in my life, or do you mean in terms of?
Yeah, like what? Like, well, I know you're reading a bunch of papers and learning, maybe you're hacking on things and playing with new tools, but then you're also meeting people who are trying to build, companies and kind of products and services that serve the world in some way that kind of have like a, an economic outcome. And I'm wondering, like, is there any pattern in like the people building the companies are kind of coalescing around one area, but like the more wild, like maybe like we talked about the generative art, like what would the future TikTok look like that really, you're sort of, instead of swiping from video to video generated by a human, you're like exploring a dream space that adapts to like what you want. Like, I don't know, but my guess is it's early for somebody to productize that, but that seems like that seems like directionally something that should happen at some point, and it seems like something that like maybe with some of the GAN stuff or the some of the GPT-3, like the Imagen and DALL-E and stuff, that might give a hint at what that future looks like, and maybe that future is like will someday be some economic opportunity, but today it's art, it's creativity, it's curiosity for its own sake that may lead to something. So do you feel like, is there a lot of overlap between the things that can be done now and that may be productized soon, or are they just sort of like vastly different spaces that have like a very minor possible overlap?
Okay, so I'm a pretty big believer in I'm a pretty big believer that if things turn out slightly differently, we would not have like the sort of we live in a world now where there are lots of like individual devices that are black slabs that you hold on to, right? And it feels so inevitable, and it seems like it totally makes sense. And I'm a pretty big believer that there's totally another version of the world where that never happened because, someone got in a fight with Steve Jobs and they disagreed on some format, and instead they decided that like it should be, I don't know, there should be a keyboard on all of them, or who knows, whatever that thing is, right? And meaning that like there's a little bit of path dependency, and so and what that means is that whoever the decisions that are made right now and the people who are working on it right now and the things that end up working right now end up having lots of influence and effect, sort of. And so I don't think there's like an inevitable answer for how the technology will work. And then, because it's not like, I don't know, another version of like, since we're on my little Steve Jobs kick right now, it's not like Pixar was inevitable, right? That slightly differently, you end up with a very, very, very different world of sort of how people think about computer animation. It takes a few slightly crazy people to push some agenda ahead. And so where are we in that part of the world for generative machine learning? I think we're at the point where, sort of folks now have a language for it, like, or a way of talking about it and recognizing that it's different. I think there are a whole set of different things that a whole set of different technologies and techniques that basically coalesce into making something like this available, right? And then if you talk to the CS academics, they'd say, oh yeah, this has totally been well understood for a long time, right? And it's more like but then how this actually gets used now is like a really weird open question.
Right.
And so
this path dependence emerges by somebody. Yeah. Go ahead.
Right. It's somewhat like, but by the way, like remember these these image generation things are only possible because there's this crazy substrate of the web, and there's slightly ridiculous laws around, or lack of clarity around, whether you can scrape things or not, right? You know what I mean? And so that then lends itself towards sort of a bunch of different kinds of solutions. So I think that's how I think about it.
Well, so that's interesting. I mean, that raises a point that I haven't seen or heard much explored. Maybe I've just missed it. But like, what do all these new kind of forms of creativity, like, how does it change intellectual property law, or like property rights, like ownership?
Right. So, like, I did a presentation about a few years ago around this, and I think that like right now the emphasis is on how magical these experiences are, right? And how it feels like the machine is doing all this work to create this. But what's really happening is that you're mixing and matching, elements of prior art, right? And to be honest, like that's all for now. That's I say that's all, but like that's a substantial way. That's a one very fair way to think about machine learning, is like we're basically mixing and munging past decisions from people. And then you think about who gets credit for that and who gets blame, right? And that's an interesting question, right? Who gets so you can even use this for like old, it's clearer it's clearer if you were to look at like approving a loan, right? And let's say we stick all the loan stuff in a machine learning model. We collect the data, we come up with some new model. Who gets the benefit of that faster machine learning model, and then who gets the blame when it's wrong, right? And
Right.
and what's interesting is like all the people who worked on all the past loans, approving them and making decisions, they really don't get credit for it, right? And
Right.
that sort of traceability seems really unfair right now. And then
Right.
and then the closest analogy that I can think of are comic books. I had this presentation where I chose a slide of Batman, right? And the interesting thing about these incredibly, Batman, Superman, these are incredibly valuable pieces of IP owned by huge corporations, right? And
Yep.
the interesting thing about it is like most of them are created by artists who were working for hire, getting paid per each page
Right.
they developed, right? But along the lines of creating each page they developed, they also created incredibly valuable characters and ideas and story arcs, of which
Mm-hmm.
they get paid nothing, right? Like they get
Right.
paid, they get a credit. Like it's always a little crazy. You'll meet some old artist who's like critical to like how I thought about the world when I was 16, and then you'll ask
Yeah.
them, and they'll be like, "I got a credit in the movie, like a line, and then
Right.
no money, right? And then the movie will make billions of dollars, right? And so that sort of
Right.
traceability is a big deal, right? Is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And it seems like as communication networks become more vibrant and liquid and in real time, the nature of ideas become less kind of controlled or owned in quite the same way as maybe like it was really easy to maybe attribute this lineage or path to a particular person maybe 50 years ago when it was like you had to talk to them on the phone or see them in person or see
right.
some piece of paper they drew something on. And
So,
today already it's far beyond that, right?
I mean, okay, so in my little scenario planning, like, have you done scenario planning?
I mean, broadly, like meaning just
Or like,
planning out a few
tradition,
different.
yeah, planning out two different like numbers of outcomes, right? And
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
traditional way to doing it like gets a little obscured, but the real thing that they do is they say, let's let's figure out what are the two variables that could change that are the most impactful on the future,
Yep.
right? And so so much of the exercise is is basically a what if you're wrong thing, right? So if you assume this, like I don't know, the classic one is you assume gas prices will always be low. What happens if they go up, right? So
Right.
then you choose two variables and you come up with like two by two, and then you sort of get this guess. And so like my two by two right now for these large generative models is like, what if they're cheap or what if they're expensive? So that's one dimension. And then the other one is what if
Mm-hmm.
they're regulated and what if they're not regulated, right? And so in the case where they're cheap and regulated, like how does that happen and what does that mean? I think is a really interesting question. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
And then the only way that happens is if it's incredibly cheap to also trace where ideas come from and give credit,
Right.
right? There's all
Yeah.
this stuff, there's all this concern around explainability, which I think is a very important thing for understanding machine learning models,
Yep.
oftentimes just to fix them. But it's also possible that explainability will be used to figure out who gets credit,
Right. And
right?
who could be a human or a machine or some combination.
No, no, I mean that like, sort of when Dolly creates something, um, or one of these things creates something and you want to use it and publish it, that basically the machine says, oh, this, 1/100th of this came from this one drawing, and so therefore when you make money on it, you should give 1/100th of your
Hmm.
money to this one person, right? And that sort of like
Right.
crazy microtransaction-y world, right? Like
Right.
like that's possible. A little hard to imagine that could happen, but it could happen, right? Sort of like
Right. Well, this is
um
this is kind of the stuff I'm curious about because I I I guess I would consider myself like generally reasonably capitalist friendly oriented. Like that system of the world seems to kind of make sense and it has its flaws, but it like kind of works. But then I also have this sense that like what are the pinch points that create the ability for capitalism to work, and sometimes it's around like audience aggregation or customer aggregation or some some process that's hard to necessarily attribute to some of the downstream stuff that's fed into that. And so I wouldn't consider myself like a, super, I don't know, Stallman type, or like kind of a radical everything belongs to everybody kind of thing. Like maybe there's aspects of that, but it feels like there's stuff happening in the world that will make that vision closer to kind of, we have to somehow redefine what ownership is, because like let's say that you did contribute 1/100th of something to a creative project, but you did it either as an indie and it got no distribution, or you did it as part of a project for Disney and it got sent to 100 million people or something. Like, is your creative work of that 1% of that finished product, is it due to the effectiveness of the creative work you did, or is it due to the like distribution that Disney provided you? And I think Disney has a pretty credible argument in this world to say like, well, we already assembled the audience. We started this 100 years ago working to assemble that audience, and that's why your creative work actually even got visibility and made money. But I think there's also, the internet is kind of like anybody can get distribution, but Mr. Beast developed his own distribution on the internet, but now he can push things through that channel. And so it's not clear to me how you divide up the, if you wanted to say the economic rent of that creative work isn't necessarily directly attributable to contributions to the specific piece of work. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. I mean, I think
is that a crazy?
I think whenever you get change like this that we're in the middle of right now, it exposes a lot of the fault lines around existing assumptions, and I think that's a big deal, right? I think that's a big deal. Yeah.
Right. Have you heard of CC0?
No, what's CC0?
This is, I don't want to misquote it, so I'm going to actually pull up. So this is I think it's rather new. It's a Creative Commons kind of public domain, kind of share license, and it's called No Rights Reserved. So CC0 enables scientists, educators, artists, and other creators and owners of copyright or database protected content to waive those interests in their work and thereby place them as completely as possible in the public domain so that others may freely build upon, enhance, and reuse the work for any purpose without restriction under copyright or database law. So the place where I've seen this show up is a lot of the communities that are interested in kind of the future of art ownership and, NFTs and stuff like that. They want to issue their art under CC0 so that everybody, they can own a particular pointer to a piece of art, right? But then other people can take that, or other people in the community who are co-owners of relevant pieces of art can take them and print them up on, T-shirts and sell the T-shirts, which accrues value to the community of people holding pointers to that art, right? So CC0, I think, has become common to explore, at least where I start to hear about it a lot, is like within communities of people, and I'm not super active in those, but like the communities of people, interested in buying and owning and kind of, explaining NFTs to the world. It's kind of a new IP topic that has different sets of trade-offs than maybe, Disney would be comfortable with.
Okay, so this will be the last note before I have to go, but I do think that the fact that the marginal cost of digital goods is basically zero, and the fact that we're able to charge money for it, is one of the sort of mysteries of our current system. And there are lots of reasons for it, right? But it is the thing that I think about a fair amount, right? Both in terms of how that can continue, because it creates lots of value, obviously, and it seems like a good way to coordinate things, but also how does it fall apart? You talk to some of these folks in open source world who spend all their time maintaining things, and it's so painful and hard, right? You feel kind of terrible for them. You spend a bunch of time talking, so that whole, I think that's a great, like the sort of the weird economics of information just remain
Mm-hmm.
like interesting. So that's one part. Um, I don't know. I forget how we ended up on this, but this. Okay, I'm sorry. So this is like a world in which all these models are actually very commonplace and not centrally controlled, and yet it's
Mm-hmm.
regulated, right? And in that case, to pull
Right.
that off, you need to have very, very cheap ways of doing explainability and tracing the origins of
Yep.
different things. And then in that world, then everyone who creates something gets paid. Like you ever hear about like TV writers who get paid residuals? Do you know this?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Right, you made some TV show 20 years ago. You find you get
Yep.
a check, because someone showed it on NBC or something like that. But that sort of
Right.
world of extreme traceability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that's a scenario which might be positive if it was cheap enough. It it may or may not require like something blockchainy,
Mm-hmm.
or it could just be a centralized organization that does a very good job of it, right? So, but that
Right.
like I think those are sort of the things that are now unlocked if this world
Mm-hmm.
if this world happens.
Right. Yeah. All right. I know you said you have to go.
So
Uh,
does this how does
so I
this
don't
work?
want to.
How like does this unlock what does this unlock for you?
You're saying what these new kind of property rights questions,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Or no, just
I
this
mean,
discussion in general. Like where does this take your head?
I guess like where we went, it feels like I guess I still have like I think it opens up to my mind what is the future of ownership. And I
Mm,
think the fact that machines can be, can start to do more creative work and presumably stuff that might have, kind of generative economic value, I think means the systems that we have or assume around how ownership works, how IP works, is sort of all up for reinvention, redefinition, kind of
right.
reimagination, let's say.
Right. Right.
And I don't believe we have any I don't believe we have any of this figured out. I think some people are like, oh, we've got it figured out. Just throw it on blockchain, then it solves. Like, no, I don't think we're like anywhere near actually figuring out how this kind of stuff should work. Like, maybe blockchains can be a part of it if we have good blockchains and immutable ones and stuff like that. But I don't think we're like we're not like 3 months away, or we haven't already discovered that. I think there's still like a lot of work required before we figure that out.
Mm. I buy that. I mean, in like there's a little bit of a um if you type Batman into any one of these generators right now, what happens? And who
Right.
benefits, right? And then who complains and who gets sued? Um,
And I think your point is Batman is owned by somebody. So the 50 years ago answer to this is fairly clear because the Batman IP is owned by, who is it,
yeah,
Marvel or somebody owns that.
yep.
And
DC.
anytime it get or DC, so anytime it gets used, they can either say that shouldn't be used or it can only be used under my license, and so
Yep.
I get to set the terms and collect the fraction of rent that I deserve for owning that digital property. When you type Batman into a generative AI, DALL-E 2 type thing, presumably it's sourcing some of that from the copyrighted content. It could be sourcing some of it from fan art, stuff that you know, exists on the internet but is not necessarily fully blessed or licensed. And then it might pull stuff from stuff to do with bats and stuff to do with men and try to like parse words out and create new stuff. And so I think what you're saying, if I'm hearing right, is like the Batman example showcases how the world today, blows open all of the definition of how do you have to explain where it came from. You have to figure out
Right.
what are the ways to rights and what are the contractual obligations between rights holders, or how should that stuff evolve?
Right. And how interesting it all will be, right? Because maybe this
Yeah.
blows open maybe this is what finally opens the world for microtransactions, or
Hmm.
maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting area to discuss, microtransactions. And I think you said you have to go, so I don't want to drag you on too long. But I think microtransactions has a huge, open-ended set of questions around like, are they done through consumer experiences? Are they done through APIs? Like,
Yeah.
are there ways to set thresholds and levels that we're comfortable with to make UX is good? And
So I think like if you look at the past, microtransactions never work on a consumer level, but they do obviously work from a settlement point of view, from financial markets
yep,
to you know to like music rights to TV
yep.
to all those sorts of things, right? And so that in some ways, I think at least in my head, that's where that traditionally works, and maybe that's where it works in the future.
Yeah, I also think like what is a microtransaction? Like we already have at least before we had unlimited data plans in our phones, we kind of all had microtransactions, but we would purchase them bundled and transact without UX friction. Right? Like I would
Right.
buy whatever I would buy, 5 gig of data for the month, and then every time I open up, mobile Safari and tap on a link, I'm microtransacting with my carrier to draw down on the bundle that I paid.
Okay.
And that
Isn't it
UX is actually
crazy?
pretty good.
Isn't it crazy that the guy who makes the money is the pipe, not the end value creator?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of an accident of how the internet got set up. And
Right.
we didn't have a global, payments infrastructure back in the 90s that could have adapted easily to the structure of the internet. And we're now like starting to have some of that, but it's not like really super widely deployed.
Right. Right. Um, okay. Well, there we go.
Yeah.
Was this conversation? Where did you want to take this conversation?
Well, I had been thinking we were going to talk a little bit more about Elad's post, but I think when you and I get together, we just have so many different ways
Sorry
to
about
take it.
that.
So I don't think there's
I mean, I
I
think
don't think there's
there's a fun in chat. I mean, it's always fun to chat with you. Sort of. Um, what else should we say about Alad's post? We should get a lot. You should get a lot to come on.
yeah.
Okay.
Let's get him on. We'll get him on at some point, and then we can just sort of talk to him about. I think there's like all these structures and ideas and stuff that he kind of outlined and overviewed, and there's probably like tons of detail that we could get into about various points there. So yeah, we should do it with him.
Okay.
Cool.
I
Always
have an
fun to chat. I'm
11:45.
glad we got to
I
do
have an
this.
11:45,
Yeah,
but it is always fun to chat with you. And I don't know. I think the two of us, defaulting it into doing it in public is not a bad idea.
I like that. Let's do some more.
Okay. Great.
Okay. See you, James.
See ya.